Hello, this is a video about stories and storytelling as a method to elicit subjectivity. Today you'll be hearing from Ella Kari from University of Waterloo and me, Johan Enquist, from Stockholm University and University of Cape Town.
Storytelling as a practice predates writing. It can be used to capture experiences and create meaning, and it's really embedded in many cultures and societies. It's the act of using words and actions to capture the imagination, and it can be used to communicate values, beliefs, and lessons. But it can also encourage people to reflect on their individual and collective understanding, awareness, or perception of themselves and their reality. Every culture has its own stories and narratives, which are shared as a means of entertainment, education, cultural preservation, or instilling moral values. They can also provide a way of investigating and understanding subjectivity.
And subjectivity is something that is often or sometimes treated as unscientific or irrelevant to research that is seeking an objective truth. But that misses an important point, an important value in subjectivity. It's particularly important as an entry point to an actor's frame of reference based on their identity and their beliefs and values. And in this way, subjectivity and stories can help to understand actors' perception, response, and action to problems. And so stories and storytelling are not a method in itself, but rather a form of information or knowledge. And there's multiple types of stories and ways in which you can engage with stories and storytelling. And each can be of interest for researchers as either a source of information or a way to engage research participants or other stakeholders in various ways. Some examples of stories and storytelling include oral narratives and spoken word. Oral narratives is probably the oldest form of storytelling, but it's constantly evolving and finding new formats and so on. Another example is plays and performances, which is a more of a form of collective storytelling that can be embodied in different actors and more immersive than oral narratives.
Yeah, and then moving forward, we've got things like visual storytelling, using images. I guess after oral narratives, you start to think about the start of cave paintings and things like that. But even moving forward in time, where we now have films and videos that sort of add to this element of storytelling. We have written storytelling, books, newspapers, blogs. And then going forward, we're now starting to see AI play a role. So artificial intelligence play a role in stories and storytelling. How is AI playing a role in generating stories? And then also how is new digital media, like social media platforms, playing a role in how we share stories and information? So each of us are going to provide an example of storytelling and how we used it as a method. And I'm going to start off by taking you over to the coast of British Columbia in Canada. And we're going to go to a small island called Haida Gwaii. And on this island, there's a keystone species, which is a sea otter. And it's been absent for more than 200 years. And now they are starting to return. But the return of these sea otters is going to change the environment in a very dramatic way. So what's going to happen is that sea otters, they eat about a third of their body weight every single day, and they eat shellfish. They use their paws to catch shellfish. And this means that lots and lots of shellfish are going to be removed from the environment. And because sea otters have been absent for 200 years, shellfish have really gone wild. They're doing very well in this environment. And you're going to suddenly see them come in, eat all these shellfish, and the result of this will be that there will be a growth in kelp. But there are going to be lots of things that are going to change with the removal of shellfish and the return of sea otters. And so I was part of a group that was trying to kind of create models to understand how this return might exist. But formal diagrams and models can be really confusing. And we wanted to communicate systems change in a way that was locally relevant and place-based. And so we thought about the idea of storytelling and creating these visual and oral narratives. And stories to us were kind of this really novel tool in which we could discuss all these different relationships and tensions and talk about how this return will change an ecosystem, not just for the species within that ecosystem, but also the people that have relationships with these species. And so these visual and narrative forms of stories were actually used to help elicit governance insights from local community members. And they were very useful in that regard. So we used knowledge co-production to create the stories. So the process that we went about was we got together this group of people, and we spent a lot of time thinking about who should be part of this group to create the story. And it was 8 members. It was a mix of Indigenous elders, youth, anthropologists, archaeologists, all from the Haida community, which is the local community on island.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to ask, is that the main population there, or is it a mix of indigenous and other populations?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So out on the island of Haida Gwaii, there are communities that are indigenous and they live on reserve. And there are sort of 2 main communities, one in the north and one in the south. And then there are also, people who have come and settled on the island and they don't live, some of them live within reserve, but most of them kind of live outside of reserve. But it's very mixed and people get on really well in general. However, for the purposes of this study, we really wanted that Haida knowledge because we wanted to engage with that really ancient indigenous knowledge that comes from within the communities and is very much embedded in an oral tradition that has been passed down from generation to generation. It was actually really important that we had people from both the north and the southern communities because although both of them are part of the Haida community, it's really important that you get sort of place-based knowledge from 2 different points on island because there are different places there, which I guess kind of brings me to the next point is, when we started off, we said, okay, how do we even start to tell a story about sea otter return when everything is so important? And we thought, well, maybe what we should do is we should think about 3 things. And the one is place. They need to be places that people know. So at least 2 places that people can relate to and imagine and they can actually go there. And then we need to think about the habitat. So we need to make sure that we're not just showing rocky reef, rocky reef, rocky reef, but maybe one beach habitat, one beautiful estuarine habitat, a rocky reef habitat, so that there's a mix of different habitats so that we get a mix of different species interactions that are going on there. So we got together and first, we sort of framed up the scenarios and then I went away and I worked with a graphic artist. We also had a professor who was part of this who was an expert in sea otters. So any paper pretty much written on sea otters he's been part of. So we could ask him questions about how they might, be in this kind of environment. So the sessions were each about 3 hours long and we would have these like really rich, interesting discussions. And then we'd go away and I'd sort of do some draft sketches and come back and then we'd with the graphic artist and then we'd move on to the second meeting where we'd start to refine the details in those sketches and the stories that go with them. And then by the third meeting, we actually had the sketches pretty much complete and the stories pretty much complete. And then we turned our attention to the governance questions. What are the questions that we want these stories to elicit? So this was done in partnership with the Council of the Haida Nation and Parks Canada. And it was part of the Haida Gwaii Ku, which means sea otter project. So these are how the sea otter future scenarios ended up looking. You can see the red stars are showing where these different areas were. The very southernmost tip is actually a Haida heritage site and national park reserve. So it's actually an area that you need a boat to access and it's a little bit more private. So we only had one in there. And then all the others were in areas that you could drive to quite easily or take a boat to very easily. And we had 4 different scenarios. So if you look on the left, that is how it looks right now. And then on the right was how we think it will look in about 50 years from now. And so just to give you an example of one of them, if we look at the top left-hand corner, we've got Kungut Island. And at the bottom, there's like a little kind of horizon. So it gives you a sense of the place. And then we dive underwater and we see how it looks underwater. And the one side you can see there's a lot of sea urchins that have kind of really flourished with the absence of sea otters preying on them. And lots of shellfish, but unfortunately there's not a lot of kelp in that picture. But if we go over to the right, you see that there's a huge amount of kelp. And the story that we would give, which would be read by my Haida colleague who would read the story in a mix of Haida and English, Rain Boyko, she would read out the story and then I would sort of ask the governance questions. But she would very nicely explain in the story that goes with this image about how the kelp has recovered in that particular picture, how rockfish have increased by up to 46 times because they have this nursery and this habitat, how the shellfish have over time, declined, but they've also learned to hide. And so you actually do have a flourishing area of shellfish. They might not be as big as they were before, but the numbers would still be quite impressive. And so you see this complete change in environment. It's not positive everywhere. In a beach environment, you're not going to see a regrowth of kelp necessarily there. You're going to see a huge decline in shellfish and, of course, predation on crabs.
So each of these four scenarios that you have, are they all based on an actual kind of systems model of the kind of ecology and the system? And this is just kind of a different way of representing it.
Yeah, so instead of having a model that has, maybe kelp and how it changes over time, and then shellfish, how that changes over time, and then you sort of have these graphs overlaid on one another, we sort of took that and we turned it into a visual instead, and then had an accompanying story that kind of added more depth to what was going on. So we also talked about the otters, that maybe in a reef area they'd be in a 5-kilometer sort of radius and in rafts with mums and pups. Whereas if you look at the beach scenario, which is right down in the bottom right, you wouldn't really get many mums and pups there because it's a very rough beach environment, and local people know this. So actually you would get non-territorial male otters coming into that area, and only in the summer months. And so there was a very specific story to each place, but it was that place-based story that people really related to. And then lastly, what came out of this? So we would go into these sort of big rooms. One image that comes to mind is, we would chat to a whole bunch of elders. We'd read out the stories to them. They'd look at the images. And then we would ask them questions. And what we found that came out of this was people really believed in it, and they bought into it because they knew who had been part of it. It was really important that we hadn't just kind of done it from a scientific angle, but we had done it in partnership with very respected local community members who were from both the north and the south. And so people got very engaged in it. They really wanted to give feedback because they also found it very understandable. It wasn't complex. It was really interesting, and they could ask challenging questions and say, well, could this work? Could that work? So then management strategies started to come up. For example, people would say, well, if the sea otter population got very big, maybe hunting those non-territorial males which are coming over to the beach, maybe that could be something that comes up. Or people also mention things like, well, we have a right to be here, but sea otters also have a right to be here. So how do we respect one another's rights? Are there areas where maybe we can let them harvest and areas where we can still harvest? And overall, a lot of support saying, we need research to understand the return over time. We also want to have our own data and our own research and build up our own repository of knowledge around this. So really very rich feedback, and ultimately, this work now belongs to the Council of the Haida Nation, and the outcomes of this work is there to really support efforts to encourage ongoing shifts in decision-making that are system-oriented, inclusive, and collaborative, and center reconciliation.
Great. So the second example we want to talk about here is from Cape Town in South Africa, where me and some colleagues I've been working with studied experiences of water issues in the wake of a big water crisis that happened a few years ago. So the part of the reason why we wanted to do this was that during this crisis, was kind of referred to as the Day Zero drought, there was this dominant narrative of water shortage being the main water crisis that's hitting the city of 4 million people. But we also knew that at the same time there was a more complex reality of especially in informal and settlements and in low-income areas where a lot of the infrastructure is inferior, there's leaks, access to water and sanitation is not always as it should be, and there's problems of flooding as well during the wet part of the year, and affordability of water services is also an issue. And so we really kind of wanted to capture that. And we found that stories can be a way of nuancing and expanding the understanding of this kind of complex issues. So the project is really kind of a partnership between academics at University of Cape Town, a water activist network called the Western Cape Water Caucus, and an environmental NGO called the Environmental Monitoring Group. And we settled on a method called SenseMaker, which is a tool to sort of convert stories into powerful, convincing data that gives local actors a way to kind of convert their experiences and their lived reality into a narrative that's also understandable to decision makers and kind of give them a seat at the negotiating table around these issues. So the SenseMaker approach is a sort of a methodology that uses stories as a data collection tool and to understand subjectivity at scale. So you can reach a larger number of people and still kind of capture their personal stories and experiences. The way it works is basically it has initial prompt in a survey, and then followed by these kind of sense-making follow-up questions that are standardized and sort of multiple choice questions or sliders and so on. I'll show an example of this in a moment. And this allows the participant to really kind of code their story and tell the researchers what the story is actually about. And the way we approached this was also to design all these kind of follow-up questions and the initial prompt in a participatory way. So we worked with our local partners to find a way to phrase the questions and use terms and language that would be understandable to the research participants and really invite their perspectives into the research. And as a form of the data collection, we also worked with these local partners a lot to build trust with local communities and understand how we can present the research in a way that invites people to engage and sort of share their experiences.
Yeah, this is super interesting, and I see you've got kind of 3 pictures here of what looks like meetings. Was this like multiple meetings in person? How many people were involved? Because for me it was like kind of small villages, and this looks like a much bigger sort of setting.
Yeah, so basically these photos are from our workshops the first one is from when we were designing the SenseMaker, the kind of the questionnaire and the questions. So we were meeting then with the Western Cape Water Caucus, this local community group, and they nominated 12 of their members to participate in this process, and then also participating was a couple of people from this NGO that I mentioned that kind of helped support the community group, and then the members from the Water Caucus were actually the people who went out and collected the data. So they were the ones who went out into their communities to talk to their neighbors, talk to people they know had various types of water issues. And that was also a really important way of gaining people's trust. And so that is not academics coming from a research center, but it's actually people from their own communities. And they could say, like, look, I also live here, I also have issues. Will you please share with us what your experience is? So that was a really key part of the data collection, and making people comfortable sharing their experiences. And what we also did as a final step was, and you see that in the bottom 2 pictures here, was returning stories and basically sharing what we had found in the data, sharing that back to the communities where we had collected stories. And that was something that we let the Western Cape Water Caucus lead in many ways. So they developed their own skits or little presentations where they used both the kind of the quantitative data and the qualitative data that we had collected to present back. And that was a really useful way as well to kind of show community members that what their experience is not unique, is actually part of a bigger issue in many communities. And to illustrate what this can look like, I wanted to share some of the examples of the data itself. This is one respondent's story, and it also shows how they sort of coded it in the follow-up questions. So the story basically is about how this person's grandma, their house had the water cut off. And they're saying, oh my word, it was horrible. There are 3 families living on the property, but their incomes are not that much, which means that the water bill is extremely high, an extremely high expense. And they had to ask neighbors and family for buckets of water to survive. After struggling for many, many months without water or adequate sanitation, the matter was addressed. But by that time, the children were sick and the ladies in the house had infections. And here you see that this person describes their story as one where it didn't have any solution. There was no improvement in the story, despite people's efforts. And in their view, normally when you resolve water problems in your community, you have to bypass the law rather than work within the law or work through informal channels. And so in these triads, you see that there's a lot of dots, and each of them represent one respondent. So we have over 300 stories in total. And what the SenseMaker tool is really useful for is that you can zoom in on a section of those triads and look at all the dots there and link that to the specific stories that people have shared to see kind of what explains certain patterns and so on. And just to share a different story here, to give an example, there was a leak in the outside tap, which is the main supply for the house. I phoned the municipality, but there is still no one that has come to fix the leak. I had to make do on my own by hiring a plumber to fix it. And here they code their story as being finding a temporary fix and working through informal channels. So we have, as I said, over 300 of these stories, and it's a kind of really powerful way of linking qualitative and quantitative data and use the stories and storytellers' perspectives as a way of understanding subjectivity at scale.
Those are really great stories and quite powerful examples of how like people not only can tell the story, but then they can also code it. So once this information was created, what was kind of the next step that happened? Because you're working with these NGOs, so what happened with this data and these stories?
Yeah, so we had, as I mentioned, we had these kind of sessions of feeding backstories to communities, but also, I mean, part of the reason that we were collaborating with these groups was that they really wanted to find better ways at communicating with the city and municipality. And they had been, the Western Cape Water Caucus had been active for over 20 years, and they'd often kind of gotten stuck in that the city was asking them for, well, what's your data? We hear your grievances and so on, but what's your data? What's your evidence for what's going on here? So they really wanted to find a way of conducting a study that the city would find credible. And so what we were able to do is we were able to give this the story pack with all the stories that they collected, as well as this kind of quantitative data with numbers of basically what people are experiencing. And we even had some meetings with the city and the Water Caucus together, and had this as a kind of basis for discussions. And both sides actually came to us afterwards and talked about how this was a much more productive discussion than normally. Normally they kind of get entrenched in different sides and struggle to actually listen to what the other one is saying. And now they had something to relate to that both sides could take seriously and had trust in. So that really kind of helped how the discussions were going. So I think there were several kind of conclusions from this project that we drew. I think first of all, we really kind of felt that stories were really useful to exploring these kind of complex, interconnected issues with greater nuance, where people really got a chance to explain how different problems were interlinked with each other. And that's also something that the City of Cape Town, the municipality, said, that like having the qualitative stories actually helped them also understand how different problems are happening at the same time for many residents. We also found that it was a really relatable form of data, both for us as researchers, but also like our non-academic partners and the audiences in the local communities. And we think that it also really facilitated ownership and a sense of legitimacy for the Water Caucus that we worked with, and helped them when interacting with decision makers. They could feel like this is a study that we conducted, and they were talking about it as something that they had ownership of, which I think was really important for their sense of agency when interacting with the city. But what's also an important lesson that we learned is that providing a space to share for local residents can be really therapeutic. I mean, a lot of our data collectors reported that people spoke quite a long time in addition to the data that they shared. But this is also a bit of a challenge, because it can really shift the burdens and raise expectations that the people who are collecting the data are also going to find a solution. So we really had to work with our local partners to kind of make sure that they knew how to balance that role, because it is a tricky one and not something that was easy for them to step away from, because they're used to being activists and used to taking action and finding a solution as soon as possible. But yeah, overall, I think stories that are collected in a systematic way like this can really help bridge the mistrust between different actors by providing an account of these real world problems that both community actors and authorities can acknowledge and treat as legitimate, and kind of help their discussions and the collaborations going forward.
So that was a really great example, and I think right off the bat that that element of trust and those relationships that exist, the fact that the community members went out in your case study and could gather all those insights, and in my particular case, how community members were involved in the co-production of the stories. At the end of the day, that's what generates the trust that really gives you these rich insights. So it's this element of the very human aspect of telling stories mixed with trust that I think really stands out to me across those two kind of case studies. And then, of course, when we look at stories and how you can synthesize the insights, stories really provide meaning, and they show the complexity of people's lives and cultures and behaviors, and the effect that something like a water shortage has on people's health, for example, in your one story, or the effect that sea otters might have on people's food security. It really connects those, and they're also very relatable. You listen to that story and you can really empathize with that person and see that person's point of view. It's such a human way of relating, and it really engages a much broader audience than your let's say kind of your modeler or your person who's looking at a graph. It's a very different way of understanding it. And I also like how, you had people coding in your example. And of course, in my example, we're co-producing these stories. And so there's this aspect of working together and creating not just through the story, I guess you're creating meaning. And so it's this interesting, space where as a researcher, you're actually completely involved in the process. There's no kind of separation of subject, which I think goes back to your point when you started off with subjectivity, where it's not like this objective kind of scientific thing, but it still has so much meaning, and you're able to elicit these incredibly personal perspectives that have value.
Yes, yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think stories are also like really powerful in that they can do multiple things at the same time. It's both a way of learning about a system and having information and knowledge, but also, I mean, as I think we both showed example of, it's a way of engaging with the system and influencing it as well. I mean, I think your scenarios are a beautiful example of that, because they really kind of invite local communities into thinking about, okay, where are we going, what are different options, and sort of what's the future going to look like. And so stories really have that dual role of learning and engaging. And I mean, as I've been talking about, they do help us understand and engage with subjectivity as something that's it's not just something that's an imperfect form of reality. It's really kind of the different ways that we perceive and think about, and how we fear different sort of parts of the world around us. And I think the way you need to look at subjectivity is that these different stories and these different perspectives really help us shape a collective truth. And I think that's how you really kind of, the value comes out as well. And I think that's something that stories really help bring out. And lastly, also, I think stories and storytelling really can be used to, as a really powerful complement to numbers and statistics to inform decision making and engaging with sort of governance systems. And they can also really kind of reveal power dynamics that are embedded within these systems, and who has access to what benefits and where burdens are placed and so on. And I think having the personal stories of how people are experiencing it really helps highlight that. So these are just kind of two examples of how you can engage with stories and storytelling. There's many methods where this can be incorporated. There's several examples that you'll find in the SES handbook. And I think it's just important to remember that it's not a method in itself. It's more like a form of knowledge or an engagement. And so depending on how you use it, you might use different sort of formats or different social contexts that you need to consider, and you might need different resources. So to conclude, we have a kind of few take-home messages. I think stories can be thought of as a really kind of powerful boundary objects that facilitates exchange between different types of knowledge, between scientific knowledge and other local forms of knowledge, and invites people into that exchange. They really kind of allow for active co-interpretation and co-creation of meaning through the kind of storytelling process, where you have one person's subjectivity and their experience coming out and being interpreted by the audience or the person that is recording the story, which is a really kind of powerful way of creating meaning together. And stories also kind of allow you to discuss and unpack different perspectives without being constrained to that sort of single truth. You can, which is really useful for scenarios or for envisioning different futures and allowing kind of creative exploration of that.
We will add though, storytelling is time consuming, and part of that building trust and relationships means that there needs to be ongoing engagement and navigation. Communities can burn out, so you need to take time over it. For example, in mine, there was a month between each meeting, so we had time to digest and really think about things and work on stuff. You also, not everyone is going to agree on everything. And so there are, multiple realities and versions of the same truth that do need to be unpacked and understood. And storytelling, it's also fantastic in itself, but it also works really well when it's complemented with some of that quantitative data as well. So we're really trying to bring together lots of different knowledge types together. And that means that to do that well, you really need that time aspect that needs to be considered. And I guess our takeaway conclusion is really that storytelling is also a way that you can reflect on the process and sort of reveal subjective experiences. So someone's story as an elder or as a hunter. And this also kind of, I think, as researchers yourself, it can invite this reflexivity element. So it can really make you kind of reflect on assumptions that you might have, how you see yourself and your role.
Yeah, and I think with that, thanks for your attention. If you want to learn a bit more about what we have been talking about, you can read an LS PhD thesis.
Full thesis.
Full thesis. There's also 2 papers that I published with colleagues about how we use SenseMaker in Cape Town. So you found those references here. Thanks.
Thanks. Goodbye.